Welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of the High Peak Democracy Podcast. I'm your host, Nigel Gourlay.
Hello, I'm Robert Largan. I was the Member of Parliament for High Peak between 2019 and 2024.
My guest today is Rob Largan, who was the Member of Parliament for the High Peak from December 2019 through to last month, when he was defeated at the general election by John Pearce of the Labour Party. I have Rob on the line, and over the course of this podcast, I'd like to ask him some questions about his life, local democracy, and the role of an MP within it. Let's start with a clip from a speech you made in Parliament in 2020.
My dad was one of 8 children from an Irish Catholic family in Salford. He was the only one of his siblings to pass the 11 plus and went on to do a wide range of jobs, from being a Shabbos goy to a postman to a trade union shop steward. My mum left school with no qualifications after having to take care of her younger sisters following the death of her father on her 11th birthday. Despite that, she had a groundbreaking career at the DSS, helping unemployed people back into work. My parents taught me the importance of public service and doing the right thing. They are the reason I'm standing here today. It fills me with more pride than I can ever fully explain that they're able to watch me give this speech.
When I was a child growing up in New Mills during the 70s and 80s, I must say that I wasn't interested at all in national politics. I vaguely remember the power cuts and my dad being on strike. But during your childhood, was it particularly political? And what do you remember?
Yes, we were definitely a politically engaged family. I mean, my dad used to be a trade union rep. Politics was always part of kitchen table discussion, as it were, growing up. So we were always very political, but not necessarily all that party political. And I was born in 1987, so I grew up in the 90s and the early noughties when I left school. And you look back now on the 1990s as almost something of a bygone age of calm and stability, where it was post-Cold War, but before 9/11. And so actually there wasn't anything particularly dramatic going on in political life in this country, and everything was relatively calm. I'm sure at the time that I perhaps didn't feel that way. And I don't remember that much of party politics. I vaguely remember the 1997 general election and the sort of excitement around all of that. But the first sort of really big political events that stand out was 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, tuition fees, the Iraq War. Though that kind of time when I was sort of 15, 16, that's when it started to pick up and I became much more politically engaged and much more politically aware.
I remember at the beginning of the 1990s reading Francis Fukuyama. To him, it seemed obvious that America had won the Cold War and that history itself had ended. The only job for elected politicians was how to manage the economy most effectively.
Yes, well, that feels like a very long time ago now. I think it's been one of the striking things of the last few years is the realisation that no, history very much hasn't ended. The sort of Whig view of history, or progressive view of history, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards progress, which sounds lovely. But the last few years are a very stark reminder that actually, no, that's not the way things work. And quite often, civilizations collapse and we can fall back into living in the ruins of cities that greater civilizations built, surrounded by the statues of forgotten gods, stealing stones from aqueducts, having no idea what they are and how they work to put up houses.
I think going off to university has now become a time when young people break their family ties and build character. Now, you went to Manchester University. Did you get involved with student politics? Were you particularly politically engaged?
I was, actually. And I didn't originally intend to be. And certainly in my first year, I was far too busy getting up to all sorts of mischief to get involved in politics at all. And I sort of mostly looked on campus politics with disdain and contempt. I found myself getting drawn into it largely because, I went to university kind of in that mid-noughties period, sort of after the invasion of Iraq, as things were starting to go very, very sour. The student union in Manchester got very radicalised. There was a group of people from Respect, which at the time was George Galloway's outfit, and the Socialist Workers Student Society, SWIS, as they were condescendingly referred to, who sort of seized control of the University Students' Union. And effectively, there was some very nasty politics going on. There was attempts to ban the Jewish Society as like a Zionist organisation. The union was twinned with a very questionable university in the West Bank. They rewrote the student union's no-platform racism policy to effectively remove anti-Semitism as one of the things that they considered no-platformable. It was be whoever the Students' Union executive considered to be, in quotes, fascist. There was all sorts of really unpleasant stuff going on. I have very vivid memories of being stood on the Student Union steps with a very large crowd chanting 2468, let's destroy the Zionist state, 3579, death to Jews in Palestine. And funnily enough, that drew me into student union politics and very heavily shaped my political outlook, and did end up getting involved.
Did you know at the time that you were a Conservative, or was it you felt that you opposed what was going on?
I think by then I definitely shaped my view that I was a Conservative. I didn't particularly want to get involved in that kind of thing, but I was horrified by what was going on and did want to get involved. And you ended up with this incredible coalition of the young Conservatives, young Labour students, the Lib Dem students, the Jewish Society, and a few others, sort of forming an electoral coalition, which is pretty incredible when you think about it, standing against the sort of hard left who'd seized control of the university. It was a very dramatic election campaign. I'm pretty certain George Galloway came up to campaign for the hard left candidates at the time. You know, we won a sweeping victory, crushing the hard left. I've still got the front page of the Manchester Students' Union newspaper, the front page where hard left suffers crushing defeat. But what was most striking about it all was that lots of the people who were in... I've made lifelong friends from that time, actually, like people who were Labour and Lib Dems and stuff, who I'm still very close friends with today. But a lot of the people who were on the hard left, who were sort of leading these pretty horrendous things that were happening, then all joined the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And all the Labour guys that I'd worked with, a lot of them left the party under Jeremy Corbyn. It was a topsy-turvy time.
It seems very different to my experience of university politics, which was mainly about beer prices and how the National Union of Students was going to increase the amount it cost to get drunk.
Yeah, well, that's what it should be about. And in fact, our campaign was largely based on: are you fed up with these clowns stood outside the student union with a megaphone shouting about national politics? Don't you think our students' union should focus on things like declining contact hours with lecturers and professors, opening the library 24/7 during exam times and things like that? Don't we think that the Students' Union should be talking about our issues rather than parading around as if we're the United States Senate or something?
I think now's a good moment for another clip from the House of Commons.
Far too often, politics is boiled down to a contest between a simple, easy-to-sell magic solution and the nuanced, hard-to-explain truth. And the truth is that governing is hard. It involves taking almost impossible decisions between competing lesser evils. There are rarely, in reality, obvious right and wrong choices. So we should be wary of those who are always certain or never change their minds. Ideological purity is a moral maze many get lost in. And for that modern Puritan, it's no longer enough to accept that someone disagrees with them. They think that others can only disagree with them because their motives are malign. And if our history has taught us anything, it's that we must reject that Puritanism.
So you still believe that ideology should be secondary to the job of just running things well?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, having an underpinning philosophy of life is a natural thing, and people should have that. People should have their values. But when people get stuck into this obsession of ideology and purity and conviction above all else, I find that an extreme, one, tedious, and two, incredibly dangerous. I remember back in the Corbyn days when people used to say, a great thing about Jeremy Corbyn is he's a conviction politician. He's not changed his views since the 1970s. And for me, that was one of the biggest red flags about the man. And I changed my views on things since last week. You must completely close-minded to not change your views in over 50 years. I change my views on things all the time because the information that we have, our experiences change, the facts change, and we should change our minds accordingly. But for some, it's all about the ideas.
You went into accountancy after university.
Well, I did economics and politics at university. And I didn't go straight into accountancy. And if you'd have told 18-year-old me that I was going to end up as an accountant, I would have been horrified. In fact, what I was originally going to do at university, I was due to join a grad scheme in public relations or something like that. And then instead of joining a grad scheme, it was the 2008 financial crash. Not only did they cancel the grad scheme, I think they let go of most of their workforce. And so suddenly I was without a job to join when I left university. So I did all sorts of things. I carried on. I worked on the fish counter at Asda for a few years. I worked as a door-to-door salesman at one point. I did all sorts of bits and pieces and ended up applying for a job working in politics for a Member of Parliament, Greg Hands, and got that job completely by chance and did that for a couple of years because it was the only job available. But I knew that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted a career. I didn't see any sort of career in politics. So I then went off to night school and became an accountant, largely because I wanted a profession. I wanted to have something that would allow me to sort of work anywhere in the world and have the experience of working with lots of different businesses and learn as many skills as possible. So yeah, I went to night school and did that.
We've had conversations about the role of an MP several times over the last 4 years, but it's probably worthwhile rehearsing again. I've always thought it was a bit like an underqualified social worker.
Yeah, well, the job of being a Member of Parliament has dramatically changed since the middle 20th century or the 19th century, when it was very much more about debating big ideas in Parliament. It's very much become almost like a super councillor role, or a very large amount of time and resources spent on casework and helping people and dealing with local issues. That's definitely the case. And there's a good argument to say that a big part of that is because of the weakness in local government, where MPs have got resources, they have offices, they're full-time. When councillors are part-time, they're on very small allowances, they don't have offices, they don't have resources. I think a lot of the sort of MPs becoming these kind of casework machines is a function of the sort of weakness in local government. There's an argument that if you think MPs should be doing their core function of scrutinising legislation in the government, then you need to significantly increase the resource and power of councillors, because local government's incredibly important.
And you're speaking here as a former councillor yourself, aren't you? There is a kind of informal career path to becoming an MP, with the first rung being elected to a council. Was that a career decision you made?
I was asked to stand. It was one of these, a lot of councillors, as I'm sure you know, will say that the reason they stood is because someone in their local association said, "Oh, go on, can you stand for us? You'd be great, please. We need a candidate." And also at the time, I became a councillor in 2014, so I was working in financial services. And I kind of missed politics as a hobby. And, I thought, go on, I'll stand. This will be a fun thing to do. And it'll be a good way of improving the area that I live in as well. And it's a way of being involved in politics while also pursuing my career in financial services. I had to do all my casework on my lunch break. There's a lot of people who always sort of thought, how on earth did you do quite an intense job at Deloitte in the city while also being a councillor? Eat my lunch at my desk and do all my council emails on my lunch break. That's the way I used to do it.
Did you find being a councillor frustrating?
Well, sometimes. There were things where, I go to officers and say, we need to fix this, we need to change that. It was always very pleasing when you'd ask for a pothole to be fixed or a park to be cleaned up, and then it would happen. This sort of low level, but actually really important, small stuff at a local level, which can have like a really big positive quality effect on people's lives. One of the things I took great pleasure in as a councillor was I was a councillor, it was in Hammersmith and Fulham. Rick Mail, famous comedian, had died, and in his great show Bottom, the opening credits are him sat on a bench in Hammersmith Broadway, scowling, and managed to get a memorial bench installed for him on Hammersmith Broadway, which I'm pretty certain no officer would have thought of doing unless I happened to have been a councillor and a Rick Mail fan. Got to do these sort of small, fun, interesting things, which were really good, and leading a campaign to save a bus, which the mayor, who at the time was Boris Johnson, wanted to shut down and managed to keep open. I used to really enjoy it. I also served on the planning committee, which was fraught with excitement and interest. A highly controversial area of planning.
I'm going to look at the planning process in a future episode and talk to the councillors who are involved with it. Obviously, there is political involvement, but it seems so constrained by regulation that you might as well have an official taking those decisions.
Yeah, there are big challenges with it. You'll often have officers come to you and say, well, look, we've got to approve this because it'll definitely go through on appeal. If we reject it, all we'll do is cost the council money on the appeals process. So we're telling you you've got to accept it, which is very frustrating at times. But also, these things would come to you with a fait accompli. It would be, this is the plan, this is what's happening. There was never any, okay, this is a development which is being looked at. What do you, the councillors, what do you, the planning committee, think should be the focus here? What do you think should be the design? What sort of style do you think would be the most appropriate for that area? And it would just be, you're given this is what it's going to do. If you reject it, we'll lose on appeal and it'll cost loads of taxpayers' money. So please just approve it. That was a very large part of it, which was very, very frustrating. But I was highly unusual as a councillor on a planning committee back then, because this was obviously in inner London, and we were building an awful lot of housing. And I think I voted to approve over 10,000 new homes to be built in my 3 years on planning. We did a huge amount, and it was obviously of high density. But my view was always, if we're not going to build high density housing here in inner London, then where would we do it? And this is obviously where we need to be able to build homes, where there's the highest demand. If you've got a large number of young, ambitious people who want to be able to afford a home and they couldn't do it, then that is a big problem. London has an absolutely catastrophic housing market failure, where there's nothing in the middle. There's lots of rental stuff. If you are extremely wealthy, you can do very, very well. If you're fortunate enough to qualify for social housing and be able to get on social housing, there's a very large amount of social housing in London, one of the highest proportions anywhere in the world of any major city, actually. But there is no middle income, there's no sort of middle class aspirational housing really left inside in London. Very little of it left at all.
At some point when you were a councillor, you decided that you wanted to take the plunge and become a Member of Parliament. That would have involved a series of interviews and workshops. Talk me through the process.
Yeah. It is. It might have changed since I did it. So I did it in 2016. That's when the day I decided to apply to get approved as a parliamentary candidate was the 24th of June 2016, the day after the European Union referendum. And yeah, it involves sort of a full long day of assessments, interviews. You have to do speeches, intro exercises, group exercises, that kind of thing. A big long sort of list of exercises and assessments that you have to do. The most interesting being one where they give you a speech. They give you the title of the speech you have to give. You have 5 minutes, and then you have to stand up and give a 3-minute speech. I think my topic was, will the Great British Bake Off be a success moving to Channel 4? I was given 5 minutes to write a 3-minute speech and then deliver it. It was all very bizarre.
Looking back, do you think it was a process which was well designed to pick the best candidates?
I think some of it was good. I mean, I think some of the intro exercises and things like that they were definitely measured to see whether you understood what the role involved, or whether you thought it was all going to be glitz and glamour. And I imagine that it was trying to weed out the people who didn't really have a good grasp of that, and trying to weed out the people who were incapable of working with others and were egomaniacs or couldn't string a sentence together. But there was very little assessment of your values, or what makes you a conservative, or whether you actually are a conservative. Interesting approach for the Conservative Party.
Yes, but just like in Christopher Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, there is an implication that you're giving up some spiritual values for the sake of power. There must have been Conservative policies you disagreed with, looking back over your lifetime.
Yes. That is, how long do you have? I mean, bluntly, a big part of the reason why I decided to put myself forward is that I thought that politicians of all parties have been failing for the last sort of quarter century, last 25, 30 years or so. And I think we made a whole series of terrible policy choices. I'd say some of the ones that stand out the most would be energy policy. I think energy policy in this country has been a complete and utter disaster. The decision in 1997 to discontinue the nuclear power station renewal programme and then to sell off our nuclear industry to private overseas investors will prove to be one of the biggest policy disasters of any of our lifetimes. We're still paying for that very heavily now, and we're going to continue to pay for that very heavily for a long time to come, because it takes a long time to build those things. And as the cost of energy is going to continue to rise, as the demands on energy continue to grow, that decision, first made by Tony Blair, but then compounded by Nick Clegg in 2010, under the coalition government, energy policy was one of the Lib Dems areas that they were given. And there's a great video of Nick Clegg, I think it's sort of early 2011, saying, I've basically said no to commissioning any new nuclear power stations. And the reason is because if we start building one now, it won't come online until 2023. So what's the point? And I remember watching that in 2023 and thinking, yeah, we could do with a few new nuclear power stations coming online, couldn't we, right about now? But that's definitely the first and the biggest. One thing we've already talked about, planning. I think housing policy is pretty disastrous, whatever way you look at it. Going back far longer than 25 years, we've not built enough housing. We've not built enough infrastructure. We've talked about energy already, but reservoirs, we haven't built a new reservoir in over 30 years. And housing, we've not built anywhere near enough. And a large part of what has been built post-war has been incredibly badly designed. It's been ugly. It's designed crime in. It's not as nice to live in. It's more expensive to heat. And it's, in fact, one of the reasons why there's such sort of opposition to a large amount of house building and development is because so much house building post-1945 has been so hideously ugly. People don't like those kind of developments. It's been really catastrophic.
What you're talking about here are popular decisions by politicians which in retrospect turned out to be wrong. Are you saying that the government should listen less to the electorate?
That's a very good question. I think when it comes to major infrastructure, there's quite a lot of debate going on about how do we build these things. You look at the debacle over HS2 and how long it takes to sort of build any sort of key big infrastructure projects. The sheer length of time, the sheer number of consultations and assessments and legal actions that follow any of these things, which don't tend to be democracy, actually. A lot of these things are just sort of statutory consultations and assessments and, as I say, judicial reviews, which cost inordinate amounts of money and take crazy amounts of time. A lot of them are not really democratic in nature. They're institutional outcomes as a result of decisions made by successive government, which it is a choice that we could change. Now, Labour are looking at trying to do more what they call nationally significant infrastructure projects, NSIPs, to kind of cut out the local planning system to get more built, which sounds great, but the problem is that even those nationally significant infrastructure projects are massively subjective to judicial reviews, all these development consent order processes, these really lengthy assessments and consultations. So I suspect that they're going to find that it's certainly not a quick way of getting anything built. Another approach might be to do something which is actually much more democratic when it comes to big national infrastructure projects. Parliament has the ability to just pass an act of Parliament to build. You can pass an act and say, right, we're going to build this railway, we're going to build this new town, we're going to build this nuclear power station. And it's primary legislation, therefore it cuts out the local planning system. It avoids judicial review because it is primary legislation. This is the law. This is going to happen. And one of the things I found frustrating in government, and I suspect that Labour will find very frustrating too, is why don't we use this power to build a lot more things much quicker? That would certainly be a way of it'd be elected members of Parliament making these decisions. This is a key strategic thing that we need to build for the country, and therefore we're going to pass a law and it's going to happen. It's a much faster way of cutting out the red tape and the bureaucracy, and also preventing all these judicial reviews, which are profoundly anti-democratic in my view.
These major projects take decades of planning, and in a constituency like the High Peak, which regularly flips between Labour and Conservative, there can't be a consistent message from elected politicians over that time span. Thinking about that, how much difference does the local MP make to these projects, and how much is it simply Whitehall civil servants deciding it's time for a Mottram bypass to finally be built?
I think that there are definite influences that members of Parliament and governments can have to choose to approve these projects. The Hope Valley Line upgrade, which got approved in 2021 and was completed at the beginning of this year, 2024, is a good example of something which would not have been approved if there hadn't have been a government that wanted to do it and me harassing them continuously for 2 years. That wasn't a civil servant going, oh, we want to build this or not. It'd been driven for years and lots of people have been pushing it for years, but we got it over the line only because of continued pressure, in fact cross-party pressure, because I roped in Dan Jarvis, who at the time was the Mayor of South Yorkshire, and Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, to join the campaign as well. There definitely is a large amount of democratic decision-making there, and I think it's sort of quite an age-old excuse of either governments that have run out of ideas or departmental ministers who are not particularly good at their jobs for blaming everything on the civil servants. There are problems in the civil service, absolutely. It is the age-old sort of refrain of people who should be doing better, who like to blame them for things that haven't happened, often because they've made the wrong choices or they're not prepared to make the difficult choices to make something happen. The Mottram bypass is a great example of just how difficult it is to build infrastructure in this country. Over 50 years, talking about planning this, it's been cancelled several times, by incoming governments because we don't have enough money. I hope that it does start construction. It's supposed to start this month. We'll see whether it does. But huge amount of the delays there are due to judicial review. These are campaigners using the court system to try and override a decision by a democratically elected government, supported overwhelmingly by the local population, both at the ballot box and then in subsequent statutory consultations. And they do this via judicial review to say, oh, well, by doing this, by building this road, you're going to put at risk breaking the law. because by building a road, you're going to put at risk the government's climate change targets or their air quality targets, and therefore we're going to take you to court, which is really frustrating when it's well-intentioned legislation, which is then used as sort of quasi-constitutional grounds to overturn a democratic government's decision. And judicial review in this country is absolutely insane, where the people who are launching the challenge against decision, the amount it will cost them to take that court case is capped. It's capped at about £20,000, regardless of how much it costs the government in delays for the infrastructure project, for legal defence. On the Mottram bypass, it cost them 20 grand, the campaign groups who were trying to get it blocked, while in delays alone it cost the taxpayer £10 million, which is completely unsustainable.
If we look again at the process of you becoming an MP, when you were selected to fight the High Peak seat for the Conservative Party, how did you rate your chances?
I got selected back in 2018 when Theresa May was still Prime Minister.
I remember the local elections of 2019, and there was a great deal of anger on the doorstep directed at Theresa May's government.
No, well, I remember the local elections in 2019 vividly. I remember Labour celebrating at the count, sort of laughing at me and saying, oh, well, you've got no chance, have you? At the time, I didn't know. When I got selected, I thought it was going to be a hard fight. The polls certainly didn't look great. The government wasn't in a very good position. No one could decide what the Brexit policy was. The party was incredibly divided. I thought I had a chance, but I certainly didn't think that I was sitting pretty and definitely going to win. Throughout the campaign, the whole sort of 14 months I was the candidate, I would have bet against me. Myself. I wouldn't get involved in a betting scandal, but I would have bet against myself for pretty much the entire of those 14 months.
During the whole of 2019, really, I remember you had lots of spreadsheets working out where your voters were. It was new to me. Of course, I'd seen lists of party members and strong supporters before, but you were the first candidate I'd seen who was taking the campaign process seriously.
There's a broad church of different kind of candidates, and obviously everyone does it their own way. And I'm just coming off of an election defeat, so obviously my methods aren't infallible. But I'm an accountant, and therefore, I do everything in spreadsheet. I have a very old-fashioned view when it comes to elections, which is that if you want people to vote for you, then you need to get out there and knock on your doors and introduce yourself to them and listen to their views and ask them for your support. I know that there are lots of candidates and a lot of MPs who sort of seem to think that they win elections by osmosis, just by being fabulous, and everyone will just think that they're wonderful and vote for them because they're such a wonderful person, which I find isn't a very effective method of winning votes.
So when a candidate knocks on my door and asks first whether I have any concerns that I'd like help with, and then which way I would vote if there was a general election tomorrow, why is the candidate doing that?
Well, in an election, what you're trying to do is identify the people who are likely to vote for you and therefore remind them to vote, encourage them to go and vote on election day. It's called get out the vote. So that's a big part of what you're trying to do, identify your supporters and make certain they vote. But you're also trying to identify people who are undecided, those swing voters, and therefore you can then target those people with more literature, letters, leaflets, more door knocks, telephone calls, to try and persuade them to go and vote for you. If you don't go and knock on the doors to talk to people to hear their views, then you're not going to be able to do that properly. We're in a sophisticated age where parties use demographic data and credit card data and all sorts of things to kind of come up with a model of a voter and say, oh, well, this voter we think would be someone who'd probably vote Labour or they'd vote Green or something like that. Or this person is a swing voter just based on their demographics. They try and do a lot of that, and it's got pretty sophisticated now. But it is still nowhere near as accurate as actually going and knocking on that door and talking to the person. And also, when you're knocking on the door and talking to the person and listening to their views, that is also in itself an act of persuasion. The number of people who, when I've knocked on their door for a second time or a third time, who say, oh, you knocked on my door a few years ago, you're the first political candidate who's ever done that, and no one's knocked on since, and you've come again. And I'm going to vote for you for that reason, because you actually bothered to come and listen to my views. And, when you knocked on my door and I told you about that pothole, you then wrote me a letter to say that you've reported it to the council, and then it got filled. So doing that work definitely makes a huge difference for a lot of people. But there are other MPs who take a very different approach. I won't say who, but I remember going to speak to talking about spreadsheets. It was the party looking at which MPs were doing a lot of door door knocking and which ones weren't. And there was one in quite a marginal seat who'd not knocked on a single door since they were elected in 2019. And I went to go and speak to them and said, look, you really should be doing a bit more door knocking. You've not done any. And their response was, I'm a member of Parliament. It's my job to be a member of Parliament. It's the party's job to win me votes, which I thought was a very interesting attitude. And unsurprisingly, said individual was not re-elected at the last election. And in fact, had one of the worst swings against them of any seat in the country. But there we are.
One of my recollections from the December 2019 general election was that High Peak Labour didn't know who their voters were, at least from my viewpoint in Chapel-on-le-Frith. On election day itself, Labour were reminding people to vote who I knew were solid Conservatives. The result of that election was a very slim victory for yourself, and a few votes could have made the difference. Do you agree that something went wrong for Labour's local party machinery in that election?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Given I only won by 590 votes in 2019, I am certain that if Labour in 2019 had run a better campaign, that they would have won. And in fact, if you look at the demographics, High Peak was the most Remain-leaning seat in the country that was gained by the Conservative Party in 2019, with the exception of Kensington, which I think we won on 34% of the vote in a massive three-way vote split. Demographically, High Peak shouldn't really have gone Conservative in 2019. CCHQ, the Conservative campaign headquarters, told me after the campaign that they'd written the seat up. And all of the opinion polls of the constituency seat had Labour winning, some of them by quite long margins. Labour in High Peak in 2019 dropped the ball massively. They didn't have a clue where their voters were. They spent a large amount. They had great numbers of activists, large amounts of enthusiasm and resource, lots of Corbynistas who were very, very keen on their Member of Parliament at the time. But the way that they ran that campaign was, from the other side, very gratifying to watch them make mistake after mistake. I remember on polling day itself, being out, it was a horrible wet day in December. I remember being out knocking on doors in Fairfield in Buxton and going to the voters that we'd knocked on previously, and they said they were going to vote Conservative, or they were probably going to vote Conservative, and we were going out to remind them to go and vote. I remember turning the corner on this road in Fairfield and bumping into 8 or 9 Labour door knockers who were knocking on every single door in this bit of Fairfield. And I remember them seeing me and being completely baffled as to why the Conservative candidate would be in Fairfield, which has traditionally been a very strong Labour area, and then completely confused as to why I was there, because they thought that every vote in Fairfield was theirs. And I also remember that when they opened the Fairfield box in that count, and I won Fairfield very comfortably, which I think was a great shock to the Labour Party, who thought it was solid for them.
On the doorstep, the two personalities of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn seemed to be important. Boris always put a smile on people's faces when he was mentioned, whereas Corbyn was perceived as a rather sinister figure. Do you remember that happening?
I do. Yeah, no, Jeremy Corbyn was a massive drag on the Labour vote. There were lots and lots of people saying I'm a lifelong Labour person, but I cannot vote for that man, and with good reason. I had, many reservations about Boris Johnson. I didn't vote for him to be leader of the Conservative Party. I think he's a very talented individual, a very good campaigner, and he has a knack for putting his thumb on what the British people want and what the mood of the country is. But he also had some quite significant flaws. But I never had any doubt that it would be better to have a Conservative government led by Boris Johnson than a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, a man who was wholly unfit for office on everything from anti-Semitism to his views about national security and defence and NATO. I dread to think what would have happened if he had been elected leader. But he definitely was a drag on the vote, really seemed to be out of touch with the values of a large number of people. I wouldn't say that Boris, I think one of the reasons why people liked him is he didn't come across as a typical Conservative. And so for people who were thinking about voting Conservative for the first time ever, because he came across very differently, that kind of sort of made them sort of think and reconsider. But there were also, let's not forget, there were also lots of people, including sort of lifelong Conservative voters, who really didn't like Boris, who thought he was a clown and not serious. And particularly people who were Conservative but had voted Remain, who were not happy about Brexit, and they weren't particularly happy with him. So it was a bit of a sort of swings and roundabouts with Boris. He appealed to voters who other Conservatives didn't, but at the same time he alienated a lot of traditional Conservative voters. So it was a much more of a balanced thing with him, while Corbyn was overwhelmingly a negative.
A lot's been written about the 2019 election being the Brexit election, whereas to me it seemed that those personalities played a large part. What do you remember?
I think they definitely played a factor, but I do think that 2019, when it boiled down to it, I don't want Corbyn to be Prime Minister, was a hugely influencing factor. It really was. But at the same time, it was, in many ways, a single-issue election of we've just spent the last 3 years arguing and doing nothing but talk about Brexit. We have to end this. We have to put an end to this. And there's even Remain voters who were, the message of let's get Brexit done. Let's get it done, and then we can actually move on and focus on other things was a very attractive message. A lot of Conservative votes in 2019 were lent votes. People who were voting Conservative just because they wanted Brexit over with, they wanted it done, and because they didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. And of course, in 2024, Brexit had been done, and Jeremy Corbyn was not only no longer their candidate for Prime Minister, but he wasn't even a member of their party anymore.
We're skipping ahead a bit, so let's return to immediately after the 2019 election. There was a series of votes about Brexit, and then COVID struck. It was a very strange time in local government, where the inability to meet face-to-face led to a collapse, for a short time at least, in democratic decision-making processes. What were your memories, both of that initial period of COVID and once people had worked out what should be done?
Yeah. Well, my first memory of it was, of course, originally everyone called it coronavirus rather than COVID, we shortened it, was that in January 2020, so very, very early on, I had a constituent who was from Glossop who was actually stuck in Wuhan, had been working there, and their family got in touch to ask if I could help ensure that the Foreign Office helped them get airlifted out. And so coronavirus came onto my radar very, very, very early. In fact, I think I was one of the first in Hansard. I think one of the first mentions of it is from me in that early period because of this constituency case which came up. So it was on my radar much quicker than most. But no, I remember it very, very vividly, the confusion, the sort of rapidly dawning realisation of, oh wow, this is going to be really serious. And you're still sort of finding your feet and still trying to set up your office and still trying to get things set up when suddenly, right, we're locked down. We are not going to be here. We're all going to be sent home.
You were in Glossop for the lockdowns, were you? Or were you in Westminster?
No, I was in Glossop for that big, long first lockdown. I think the second lockdown, the November 2020 lockdown, which was the worst, because that was this sort of, one, the weather was terrible, and two, it was this going back into lockdown, which felt like this sort of terrible sense of failure. That was the much worse lockdown. I was ended up in London for that lockdown just because the way work fell and I couldn't get up, which wasn't much fun. Being locked down in the Peak District was incredibly stressful and difficult and had a huge amount of work to do. But at the same time, the weather was great. Could go for walks around Glossop, which were really nice and great. And my garden in Glossop, it's like a shared garden with our row of terrace houses. And one of my neighbours had a litter of Rottweiler puppies. During that first lockdown, kind of watching this litter of puppies growing up in the first few weeks did kind of keep me safe. While the second lockdown in November 2020 was when the weather was terrible. I was stuck in a tiny little flat in South London. It was not great at all. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly not what you expect when you're coming to Parliament. You don't think that you're going to be suddenly talking, learning about immunology and pandemics and epidemiology and things like that. I mean, my maiden speech I gave on the coronavirus emergency powers legislation, which effectively was legislation in large part to give the government powers to do mass burials and mass cremations of bodies in the event where the death toll completely overwhelmed crematoriums and funeral parlours and things like that. Which is not the kind of thing that you ever really imagine giving your maiden speech on.
I remember one of the tabloids reported a leaked draft of the regulations suggesting that parks would be used as ad hoc burial grounds, and I tried to find out whether the Memorial Park in Chapel-on-le-Frith had been earmarked for such use. Of course, no one had any idea whether it had or it hadn't. It was all a bit chaotic.
Yeah, it's hard to remember now just how terrifying those first few weeks were and how uncertain it was.
There were some terrible things happening in the High Peak. The virus ripped through most of the old people's homes, but there were also some wonderful things. People were volunteering in droves to deliver food and medicines to people who were shielding themselves.
Yes. It's one of these interesting things, the psychology of it, because the top level science advice going into it was we need to be really careful about when we lock down. They knew that they were going to lock down, but the scientific advice was we need to wait and choose the right moment. And that was largely based on the assumption that lockdown would be so unpopular and so hard to enforce that it could only be sustained for a handful of weeks. And when it actually did happen, lockdown turned out was one of the most popular government policies in the history of opinion polling, which was quite an interesting reaction. That first lockdown, it really took policymakers by surprise, who thought that they were going to have large-scale disobedience, large-scale ignoring of the lockdown, really difficult to actually enforce it, when the opposite was the case. It was level of compliance incredibly high, and people were very enthusiastic about it. And it was, those first few weeks, it was a scary time, but it was kind of fun and different. People felt that they were playing their part and doing something important and part of a bigger whole, and everyone was doing their bit.
I think I can honestly say that during those lockdowns, I got more work done in my day job as a publisher than in any other time of my life. We only shopped once a week. The kids didn't need to be taken to school, and so I published maybe a dozen books during those 2 lockdowns.
It was, people were really enjoying spending more time with their family and their children. And it's totally like that period has now totally changed. Hybrid working and working from home now is absolutely prevalent everywhere. And a large part of that was accelerated and brought about by that moment. A lot of people ended up massively reassessing their lives and what was important. People were switching to working part-time, or taking a job where they had more time at home, more time with their family. A lot of people completely changed approach to life.
It was a very strange time, but afterwards, I guess the usual caseload of an MP returned. Complaints about potholes and the balancing of your commitments in the High Peak with your duties in London.
It is one of the most difficult aspects of the job, and one of the things I definitely won't miss is every Monday morning getting the early morning train down to London and then getting the late train back on a Thursday. Certainly won't miss that aspect of it. Yeah, it's amazing the number of people who sort of always ask, oh, so do you have to go down to London much? I sort of explain, yes, I have to go. When Parliament's sitting, I have to go every week, Monday to Thursday. And I had to explain that to people, who often sort of didn't quite sort of realise the amount of time that you have to spend down there. And it is a difficult challenge, being away from your family, having to split your life between 2 places. It's really hard. But it was very interesting, how the casework and your workload changed dramatically. In those first few months of lockdown, the number of emails I was getting was absolutely extraordinary levels. A large number of the emails were people asking, can I do this? I want to go and do this. Is this within the rule? And they almost sort of felt that I needed to give them permission to go and do, I want to go for a walk. Can I do it? Or I've got to go and get my prescription. It's at my mum's house, but it's 50 miles away. Can I go and do it? Will you write me a letter to say that it's okay for me to travel? Lots of that sort of thing going on. There were also people who worked in essential businesses. They worked in like the food industry or something, and they were still having to work and getting in touch with me. Well, it wasn't normally them. It would normally be their partner would get in touch to say, my missus is still having to go into work. I think it's dodgy. They shouldn't be going into work. It's not safe for them, and having to sort of explain, well, no, they're an essential worker. They have their key worker, they have to go and do it. There was lots of those kind of things going on. It was very interesting insight into the psyche of British public. But yeah, things changed dramatically after COVID. Still very, very busy in terms of casework and the number of emails and people coming to see me. High Peak in general is it's a very high mailbag. As of all the new MPs elected in 2019, I have the highest level of correspondence any member. The largest number of cases, the largest number of people getting in touch with me, the largest number of people emailing on issues.
Was that simply the rural nature of the High Peak constituency?
There are lots of rural seats, some even much, much more spread out than High Peak. I think part of it is that it's quite an engaged seat. Lots of people are quite politically engaged and certainly engaged in the local area. It's comparatively a more affluent seat with a well-educated population. And also a lot of it is because I go out of my way to make it as easy as possible for people to get in touch with me and find ways to raise their complaints and concerns. While some MPs make it quite difficult to get in touch with them and raise any concerns and issues. And once you also get a reputation for helping people with casework, that creates more casework. Because if you help someone, they'll tell their friends and family, Mr. Largan helped get my housing priority rebanded. You should try and get in touch with them too. So for every successful case, you then generate a dozen cases off the back of it from sort of other people who get in touch. If the most classic example is a Howard Town Mill car park in Glossop, where there was a problem with an enforcement camera. So loads of people getting incorrectly issued penalty charge notices. And I managed to get several of them cancelled. And then suddenly on Facebook, anytime anyone would post on Facebook, I've had an incorrect parking charge from the car park, all the replies below it would all be people tagging me in and saying, get in touch with Robert Hill Sorter, he got mine cancelled. In the end, on that particular car park, I think my office worked out that we might have cost the car park company over £15,000 in parking revenue from the number of penalty charge notices we got cancelled. So yeah, these things sort of generate their own momentum, which is very interesting, and it's good. Like earlier when I was talking about members of Parliament becoming super councillors, with a degree of frustration. To be clear, I do think it's an important part of the job, and it makes you better at understanding the legislation and the other challenges. I'm very proud that me and my team, in the way that Bridge office were able to help a lot of people. Sometimes it was only small issues like a parking ticket, but sometimes it was really big stuff like helping people get a council house, helping people who'd been denied the right to their private pension and being able to get it for them, helping people with all sorts of really complicated and difficult issues. And I'm really proud of a lot of the things that we did to help people. It might seem small on the outside, but they're massive for those individuals, and they all add up.
I think if I was in the House of Commons, I'd try to stay cool, but really I'd be thinking, oh, look, it's that famous person off the telly.
When you first get there, you're like, oh wow, that's Boris Johnson, that's Theresa May. So you do a little bit to begin with, but then they just become work colleagues. It's more when you meet non-MPs who are very famous people that kind of get starstruck, like meeting the King or President Zelensky and things like that. Or if it's someone from the world of sport, they're kind of like big kind of starstruck moments.
So it's meeting those external celebrities that reminds you that you're working in a special place.
People often ask me, what is it like being an MP? And just during the COVID first year, my answer was, I've no idea. But after that, the answer would be, well, it's 9 times out of 10, it's like banging your head against a brick wall, wading through concrete, this frustration about wanting to do things, wanting to help people, and so much of it taking so long and not being possible. But every once in a while, you are able to help someone or change something, and it makes the difficult bits worthwhile. And you also get to do lots of incredible things. You get to meet some amazing people and be there for some really important moments. Those things are really special. It's a very strange environment there, and it definitely is a bubble. The colleagues that you work with are also this wonderful microcosm of society. You'd be surprised by the people who, before I came to Parliament, who I sort of really couldn't stand and didn't like, and thought, oh God, what a windbag that person is. And then when you meet them and get talking to them, and actually you find that even if you might disagree with them on quite a lot of things, they're absolutely lovely and really good, decent, genuine people. And other people you might have quite admired, and you find them complete dullards who are totally up themselves. And also the sort of range of different kind of people. You'll meet some of the most fascinating individuals, people who are so impressive. They've got unbelievable life experience. You listen to them talking and their magnetic personalities. You can listen to them talk for hours and they're really impressive. And you think, God, this person is so good and it's great that they're here. And then you meet other colleagues, other members of Parliament, and you find yourself asking the question, how has this person dressed themselves in the morning? Complete and utter cretin and moron. It is a broad church.
When I finally escape from County Hall, I think there are 3 other councillors I'll try to keep in touch with, but many of the others I'm going to try and actively avoid them. Do you feel the same way about your parliamentary colleagues?
I mean, there are definitely a lot of people I've become very good friends with. There are some, as I say, there are some wonderful and impressive people, and then there are those of us in the middle who are just okay, like myself. But I mean, in terms of opposition, there are 1 or 2 who I have a huge amount of respect for and got on really well with and enjoyed working with on cross-party issues. I'd make a particular mention, actually, of someone I worked really well with and had a lot of respect for was Jonathan Reynolds, who of course is Member of Parliament for Stalybridge and Hyde, and he's now the Secretary of State for Business. And we work together on quite a lot of local issues, most strikingly the Mottram bypass. And Jonathan is a very good guy. I suspect that we have a lot more politically in common than he has in common with, say, Jeremy Corbyn. But a thoroughly decent man in politics for the right reasons, and always went out of his way to be incredibly courteous and helpful with me in ways that he absolutely didn't need to do. And I have a lot of time for people like that. And whatever your political background and whatever your views, if you're a good person who's in things for the right reasons and you work hard, that makes up for a lot in my book.
You've talked about your office staff, and it's obvious that one person can't deal with the volume of casework that most MPs have. I think the new MP, John Pearce, is setting up an office in Chapel with 4 members of staff, with a 5th in London. What were the types of inquiries that your staff couldn't deal with and you had to get directly involved with?
Ultimately, because I'm a terrible micromanager, I'd always have to sign everything off. I'd sign all of my own letters. I would approve everything that was going in and out. So while my team, particularly the more sort of straightforward casework, would do a lot of the drafting and everything, I would always make certain that I was keeping an eye on everything and checking everything and approving everything, because I think it's really important. One, I know exactly what's going on, even if it appears to be mundane. Particularly so I can keep an eye on, what the trends are and what the issues are coming up time and time again. And secondly, because, it's things going out in my name, and therefore I want to make certain it's right. There are obviously some things which are much more complicated and much more sensitive, and for those cases, I'd be getting much more involved, going directly to ministers to highlight those particular cases and asking for really special assistance and to really push things hard. And a lot of times, what you want to be doing is using those personal connections to really drive home how important and urgent a particular case is. That's often, there's a lot of talk about trying to modernise Parliament and, why do we not have voting electronically? Why do we have this ludicrous thing where you vote by trawling through a lobby? The whole point of the system of trawling through a lobby, the people who most want to get rid of that and go for electronic voting are ministers, because then ministers could just hide away in their departments and never be answerable to other members of parliament. But when they're voting going through the lobby, that's the moment where you can grab them and talk to them about a case and say, look, this is a really important issue. We've got to do something urgently on this. That's why I think keeping to the tradition and the old way makes total sense as the reason why we've kept doing it all these years, so that individual members of parliament representing people in a constituency can take those individual cases and those sort of real concerns to them in a much more direct and forthright way, which if we went for something like electronic voting, which would be very nice and shiny and make us much more like the European Union, it's not a good idea.
I agree. In Matlock, the few seconds I can grab with the Cabinet Member for Highways is often the most important part of the whole day.
Yes. Well, exactly. And that's why I think the personal... And it's one of the difficulties of lockdown as well, is that so many of the most important and useful bits of a meeting, I'm not even talking about in politics, I'm just talking about in a business or in a work environment. So often the most important part of those meetings was the 2 minutes beforehand when everyone's sitting down, grabbing a coffee, or afterwards when you're walking out. And, sort of informal chats and things like that. Those personal face-to-face interactions really, really matter. And so I don't think you can forever just go for a pure sort of virtual workplace environment. I don't think it works, particularly if you're a junior member of staff who's trying to learn. Working from home is terrible for young people who are trying to learn a job. It's much harder for them to learn and build up connections.
A couple of weeks ago, we were at a social event together when you were giving what felt like a farewell speech, and you paid tribute to Edwina Currie, who'd given you advice from her time in Parliament. It put into my head the question of how many people an MP can rely upon to give advice and to trust with their problems.
Well, in some ways it's a lonely time, in the sense that there are only a few hundred people who at that given moment know exactly what it's like to be in your shoes, and there's a lot of responsibility on you, a lot of pressure on you, lots of people out there sort of waiting to see if you'll mess up and jumping on any mistakes that you make instantly. So it can be, but there are, if you're not arrogant, if you're not full of yourself, and you're prepared to ask for help and ask for advice from people who've done it before, or people who have been there much longer than you have, there is a lot of advice and support out there, from some people like Edwina. Not many new members of Parliament have an association president who served in Parliament for so long, who was a minister, who did a lot of amazing things actually in her time as a minister, really fantastic things which have saved a lot of lives when you look back on her record in office, and is also such a high profile person. So people like Edwina, or my friends and my family, and also local councillors, people like yourself, knew local issues better than I did on some of these sort of quite niche chapel parish politics.
Of course, I wish that I knew nothing about that kind of thing.
Well, indeed, but also, one of the things about being a member of Parliament is you've got to be a jack of all trades. You've got to learn things about this, that, and everything, just because it's whatever comes up. When I stood for election, I didn't think that we'd have a reservoir partially collapse in Whaley Bridge, and therefore have to learn lots about the history of reservoirs and water infrastructure and canals, and ended up spending a large amount of my time talking to and working with groups like the Canal and River Trust. The people who think they know everything and aren't prepared to listen and change their mind and take advice are the worst kind of elected representatives, who think they have the answers to everything.
I was chatting to Edwina yesterday and mentioned I was interviewing you for this podcast. She said she would have asked you about the issue of underemployment. There are many people in the High Peak who want to earn more money but can't, either because they can't get the hours or because the available jobs don't pay highly. What can politicians do to improve economic prosperity here?
It's a very good question. I mean, one of the things that I tried to do with my High Peak Jobs and Apprenticeships fairs, which I set up, was about signposting and bringing businesses and employers and training providers together so that people could find that help and support, and they could, we had Google come along and do digital workshops for people who were wanting to perhaps set up their own business or their own website, and we had coaches help you how to write a CV, or apprenticeship experts tell you what sort of apprenticeship schemes are out there. And at the same time, we'd have 60 employers there, all with their own people to talk to. We got lots of people who got jobs right off the back of those events, which was great. And I'm proud that unemployment is lower than it was when I came to office. But, there is definitely an issue with underemployment. There's also an issue with people who are long-term out of work, which COVID saw a big spike of people who became long-term out of work. And there are some big challenges that the government are going to be facing about looking at the work capability assessments and what can be done to try and get people off long-term unemployment, long-term sick leave, which has really spiked post-2020, after having gone down between 2010 and 2020 quite dramatically because of the welfare reforms that were first brought in. But I think a lot of this is about attracting high-quality employers and investment into the area. One of the problems that High Peak really has is in terms of lack of commercial space that's large enough. One of my biggest kind of business pieces of casework that we get would be businesses coming to me who had been successful. They'd done really, really well. They were local success stories. They had 30 employees, but they wanted to grow. But they'd run out of space at their current industrial unit. And there was nothing of that sort of mid-level commercial space for them to move into. So they were saying, I'm going to have to relocate to Stockport. I'm going to have to relocate to Trafford Park because there's nothing here of the size and scale that I want. And I want to stay here. My workforce is here. I live here. I don't want to relocate. But if we can't find somewhere, then that's what I'm going to have to do. And some of that is a function of 85% of the borough being national park.
Do you think education might be a limiting factor? In my own county council division, Chapel and Hope Valley, it's the geographic size of Greater Manchester, but it doesn't contain any sixth form provision.
Yeah, it is a big problem when everyone's having to travel quite long distances to get sixth form education. We do have some, like Buxton colleges, they've done some extremely good stuff, but the vast majority of people are having to go into Manchester for sixth form education, which is a limiting factor. That access, a lot of that falls down to an issue of transport infrastructure. The quality of transport links in the north of England is so much poorer than in London, and that's one of the reasons why London is so much more economically successful and much more productive, because of the poor quality of transport. And I think we are making a lot of progress in that direction. I really, really do. And also when it comes to education, I think we shouldn't downplay that there have been very significant improvements in education standards over the last 15 years. Back in 2010, 56% of schools in the High Peak were rated good or outstanding. Or to put it another way, 44% of schools in High Peak were considered either failing or requiring improvement. We're now up to close to 90%, being 89%, the last time I checked, are now at least good or outstanding. That is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more children each year who are getting good or outstanding education who didn't used to be. We've gone, from having very poor literacy and numeracy and international comparators to now the best readers in the Western world. Like some of the changes, the phonics focus and the absolute laser-like focus on standards and high-quality leadership and education has been transformative, both locally and across the country. And that's going to continue to pay dividends if we don't unpick a lot of those changes, which Labour are starting to threaten that they will.
You know that I've been involved with the phonics debate since David Blunkett was Education Secretary. Back then I was working in one of the bodies providing advice to government. There has been a consensus on that issue between the two parties for the past quarter century, which has allowed progress to occur, but I wonder whether you think there are other areas where we are too political. I'm thinking in particular about the funding of care homes, where it just feels like there needs to be an agreement between Labour and Conservatives for anything to happen.
Yes. Well, I think this is one of the biggest demographic challenges facing the country. We have this ageing population. The demands on the state and the welfare state growing and growing and growing, while at the same time the state's ability to raise tax revenue is diminishing as we've got fewer people of working age. And this is not just a problem for adult social care and the health service, this is a problem across the entire public service, which is not just a UK problem, it's an entire Western world problem. And it's only going to get more acute as the birth rates continue to slip.
So how do these agreements between political parties come about? With phonics, I don't think the policy of David Blunkett was very much different from any of the succeeding Conservative education secretaries.
You kind of say that, but, in education, I think there was a lot of institutional resistance to a lot of that. And it was only Cameron in 2005 who kind of pivoted the Conservative Party into a much more collaborative position on education. Before then, the position was much more bring back grammar schools and not much thought on anything else between 1997 and 2005. But on adult social care, and this is enormously difficult because we talked about the demographic issues, but there's also this problem of the unfairness of people having to pay huge amounts of money, having to sell their homes to pay for their care just because they're unfortunate enough to have a chronic condition in their old age. And there had been a consensus. There was something called the Dilmot Report. There was a whole series of recommendations. It was effectively kind of like a royal commission to come up with a suggestion for how we're going to solve it. And this was the idea to cap the cost of care that people would pay in their lifetime. Both political parties were signed up to, in their manifestos, to introduce it. Rachel Reeves, 2 weeks ago, stood up and announced that she wasn't going to do it now because she decided she couldn't afford it. But notionally there is a consensus about what needs to be done. The problem in adult social care isn't what you do, the problem is how on earth do you pay for it? And this is politically so thorny. Let's not forget the 2017 general election when Theresa May put as a centrepiece of her manifesto effectively a partial Dilnot recommendations to try and find a way to cap the cost of care, which would have been far more generous than the system that exists. But that was painted as a dementia tax, even though it was actually more generous than the existing system. It's an incredibly emotive issue, and one which is really poorly understood by the public, because unless you have had a close friend or family member go through the care system and go through those challenges and problems, why would you know much about it? Well, education, everyone has been to school and almost everyone has children. So there is a much greater understanding of the challenges in something like education than there is in the much more thorny and complicated issue of adult social care, which extends far beyond what happens to people. Just the social care system, it impacts the NHS. If you go and talk to people at Stepping Hill Hospital, for example, they'll tell you that at any one time, 1 in 5 of the people who are in beds there are well enough to be discharged, but they can't because there's either not a care home place or a care package in place for them to allow them to go home. And then that cascades all throughout the health system, right up to the point of ambulances waiting to admit people, queuing up because there aren't the beds. And however much money you put into the NHS, it won't be enough until you fix the social care system, because everything cascades all its way through.
We have this situation in Derbyshire where Derbyshire County Council is seeking to sell off its old people's homes. And all the Labour MPs of Derbyshire have written to oppose it. But there is no money from the government to keep these homes open. Do you think this is the local MPs flexing their muscles with the Chancellor? What do you think's going on?
I think there's some of that. I think there's a very hard reality when it comes down to local government, that local government across the country is in a very, very challenging financial position. And a large part of that is driven by the enormous rising demand of costs in social care. It's also incredible rising costs for children who are in care, where there's been a massive market failure and you're seeing unbelievable increasing costs in that area for councils. And also SEND, which is exploding. As I say, it's part of this change where we're seeing the demands upon the state grow. And also I think some of it is down to policy mistakes. Personally, I think one of the biggest policy mistakes of the last 14 years of Conservative government was a mistake largely made by George Osborne and Eric Pickles right at the start of the coalition, where they made one of their choices that they were going to put a large amount of the spending restraint and the cuts that were being made on local government, while at the same time capping the amount of money that councils could raise by putting a cap on how much council tax could be increased by, which sort of is this perverse position of the amount of money they're getting from central government falling, or the amount of money that they could raise themselves being limited, creating an incentive for councils to effectively just blame Westminster and say it's all their fault that they don't have enough money, actually with quite a bit of justification. I think that was a poor policy choice. I mean, there were definitely savings that could have been made. There was a lot of fat, a lot of inefficiencies in so much of local government back in 2010. But you get to the point where your budgets are being squeezed by so much that you're not talking about efficiency savings, you're talking about not doing some of the basic things on a local level, which are really, really needed. Social care is a big part of that problem. But you also see it most visibly in the state of the roads, which is sort of a very visible symbol of decay of local government services. It also feeds into what I was talking about at the start of pressure rising on members of parliament because of lack of resource in local government, because they're seeing, well, the best way to go is to go to my member of parliament about it because I don't even know who my local councillor is. I think that was a poor policy choice, bluntly.
I know a lot of people who work for Derbyshire County Council. It's the largest employer in Derbyshire. When I've talked to them, they always point to the problem being at one layer of management above their position, until you reach the top layer, who blame the government. Given the chance, almost every council employee will tell you about the crazy inefficiencies in their work. It's so wasteful, and it's everywhere.
No, I've absolutely no doubt about that. There's definitely inefficiencies and things could be run better. But there is also, I do think that a lot of the policy choices are where those spending restraints happened that were made back in 2010. Too much of it went on local government, is my own assessment, just because local government is the provider of adult social care. This is a massive growing area of demand. And there are moves to try and fix that. They've got the adult social care additional precepts. They've increased the cap on raising council tax to try and allow councils to raise more money. There's being able to keep parts of their own business rates and things like that. And the real-term central government grant increased every year in the 5 years that I was a member of parliament. So there was a realisation, I think, that things had gone too far.
You have been critical over the past 4 years of both Conservative-controlled Derbyshire County Council and also Labour-controlled High Peak Borough Council. Do you think the control of a council by a national political party has any effect on the character of that council? Or are the policy differences fairly meaningless at a local level?
Someone once said to me that there are very few Conservative councils and very few Labour councils. The vast majority of councils are officer-led councils. And I think that's largely true. There are councils which can do amazing things. I was a councillor in Hammersmith and Fulham, which was a flagship Conservative council back in the day. Of course, those days are long since past, where they were able to reduce council tax by 20% while reintroducing weekly bin collections and having the highest rated services of any council in the country. That shows that when you do have real high quality leadership, a plan knowing what you want to do, the drive and the commitment to do it with the talent there, and senior officers who get behind that plan and want to deliver it, then absolutely you can deliver really impressive things in local government. But that is the exception and not the rule. And a lot of this, I think, is there is a lack of talent in local government. I'm not pointing that at anyone in particular. I think there are some absolutely fantastic local councillors that we have here in this part of the world. The level of resource that councillors have, the amount of money that they are paid is absolutely peanuts. And I think this is part of what the outgoing government's drive towards mayors was about. Whether you think it was right or wrong in some of their geographical choices that they made. The idea to try and professionalise local government and have leaders who've got a bit more resource behind them and a drive and are also more accountable in that the local voters know who they are. The idea is to lead to better outcomes and a bit more policy innovation. And part of the issue, one of the reasons why MPs get contacted so much is because most people don't have a clue who their local councillor is. I mean, there'll be some local councillors who are very well known in their local area, who work really hard, who are very popular and get a lot of things done. But a large number of them, most people in this country don't know who their local councillor is. And a lot of local councillors, let's be honest, they tend to be people who are retired, just because that's the nature of daytime council meetings. It's the nature of the salary that they're paid. And lots of them are fantastic. But some of them as well are doing it not because they've got a burning zeal for reform or great big ideas. They're doing it because it's a nice way to supplement their pension. And it's a way to be the big man down the pub and at the village fair. And therefore, they'll just go along with whatever the officers say they should do. And as I say, that's not aimed at anyone in particular. And I think for the most part, actually, in High Peak, we have some really, really good local councillors who are really committed, who are doing their role for peanuts, as the council allowance that they get, working incredibly long hours to very little thanks. And they should be applauded anyway. Put themselves forward for public service, giving up their free time to do these things should be applauded, because it's not an easy job. But we could make things a lot easier for them and much more attractive.
Through these 4 years, you've developed a kind of brand identity as an independent-minded Conservative. How much was that a reflection of the delicate balance of party support in the High Peak, and how much was it your own personality showing through?
I think it was more an honest reflection of where I stand. And I put it on my leaflets even in 2019 before I was elected that I'd take an independent-minded approach. And I've been very open that I don't agree with every single word of the Conservative Party manifesto. And frankly, I think anyone who tries to pretend that they agree with absolutely everything that a political party does is either a liar or is very weird. I'm in the Conservative Party because they're the least bad political party. Obviously, High Peak is a swing seat, and there are lots of people who don't particularly like the Conservative Party. Lots of people have said that they voted for me because it was me, not because of the party, which was always nice to hear.
It's quite unlikely that anyone is still listening to this after more than an hour of our conversation, but if they are, they might not understand the additional constraints that exist when a backbench MP takes a government job. Can you talk me through how you were able to express this independence once you became a Treasury Whip?
Hello, listener. Well, you'd have a lot more access to ministers and departments when I became a whip. So you were able to have that extra level of influence and access, which made things a lot easier. I'd be at the Monday morning Downing Street meetings every week. I'd be going to the number 11 weekly Treasury meetings with the Chancellor. That is a level of sort of input and involvement which gave you much more access. And in private, you could speak very frankly and say, look, I think that we need to be doing more of this, we need to be doing more of that. I'm never shy in giving my assessment of situations. And often in the whip's office, we'd be saying, look, you've got to do this, that would be the wrong choice if you did that. But at the same time, I always had the view when I accepted the job, a job which I never sought, never lobbied for, never ever expected in a million years. If they put me in a position where I'm forced to vote against something that I believe in, I will happily lose my job to vote with my conscience. They never put me in that position, thankfully.
Were there pairing arrangements that you could use so that you could say to your colleagues, look, I really don't want to vote for this business, but it's okay, I've also found a Labour MP on the other side who's not going to vote?
So pairing arrangements happen, but they don't tend to happen for the reason of I don't want to vote on this. But pairing is done by the whips. The whips office of the two respective parties will make pairing arrangements, but that's more about for people who are sick or people who are overseas. That is what pairing is used for. Actually, it's considered really bad form if you were to pair someone who was going to be a rebel. That's kind of seen as a bit of an abuse of the pairing system. There are, of course, times where someone doesn't want to vote on something and the whip's office would say, well, because there's a difference between being paired and what's called being slipped. A slipped is effectively an authorised absence, but you're not matched off by a member of the opposition. And you can offer a slip to someone.
So, in effect, the MP would be able to tell people in their constituency that they would never vote for such a proposal, but it wouldn't be an embarrassment for the party. That's
what a lot of MPs would do. And in the whip's office, we would often say to someone who could say, look, I cannot vote for this government piece of legislation. And then, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we'd say, okay, well, is there an event in your constituency that you'd like to go to on that day? Maybe you might want to go and do that instead.
When you were made a whip, you didn't really make a big deal of it in the High Peak. But it is a great honour, really, to be trusted with the party's dirty laundry. Did you just think that it might be distracting locally?
I don't particularly like it's like sort of boasting about a promotion on your Facebook page. It's just not particularly my style, and I don't think that people would be all that interested in it really. But some of it is a great honour, and being able to sort of be involved in those kind of things behind the scenes and being responsible for delivering legislation. I mean, I was the whip for the Treasury, but I also, before that, I was whip for the Northern Ireland office during the whole sort of period of the Windsor Framework negotiations, which was a really special thing to be involved in and to help deliver that, which was great. You got to do when it was Northern Ireland, got to go and visit Belfast and do all of those things as well, which was really, really interesting and really rewarding. So yeah, you get to do some incredible things doing that role. And there were mistakes which I think would have been made that I was able to help avoid. But one of the things about being a whip is that your failures are very public and your successes are always secret. There is a code. You don't talk about what happens in the whip's office. It was famously broken by Giles Brandreth, who wrote a book called Breaking the Code. You're being trusted with a large number of secrets and a large number of people's personal and sensitive information. And you can't do that job effectively if you go and talk to the media about it or go to your friends and go, oh, guess what I heard? You can't do your job properly if you're not able to be discreet.
Let's talk about one of the downsides of being a publicly recognisable person. As a councillor, maybe a few people will recognise me when I'm shopping in Morrison's and ask me about temporary traffic lights, but they're always polite, and so I have this impression of my neighbours being universally nice people to be around. Now, I've seen your social media feeds, and there's an incredible amount of hatred directed towards you. Does that taint how you feel about those online groups where you see this stuff?
Sadly, I think that abuse online has become part of the job. You've got to have a thick skin, otherwise you can't function properly. I do think it's the ancient right of any Englishman to be able to criticise their elected representatives, and long may that continue. Though there is a big difference between criticising someone and some of the abuse. But for the most part, one, I don't see any of it because I turn off notifications. It's always quite pleasing that people will say to me, oh gosh, I've seen, your Twitter's awful. And I say, is it? No idea, I don't see it, because you just turn it off and therefore you don't see any of it. So that makes things a lot easier. And the knowledge that you'll then check and see that someone sort of sent you about 50 tweets in the space of 2 weeks, all sort of directed at you and all incredibly angry. And it's sometimes makes me chuckle that they're screaming into the void, of rage at me, and I'm completely oblivious. No, I think you just have to have a thick skin. If you can't take criticism and if you can't take people having a go at you, then you're in the wrong profession, 100%.
Do you think that this is just the way of things now? That there's no going back?
I think so. I do think that we might be sort of slightly looking back on a golden era that didn't really exist. If you read up about British elections going back hundreds of years ago, they were highly violent and pretty brutal, nasty contests. They've always been pretty robust. It is a shame when people... And the stuff which I didn't like was when people would then have a go at my family or things like that, or my staff. That's the stuff which I drew a red line on, and I found really, really quite unpleasant.
I know there's been a couple of times when it's spilt over from online hatred to real confrontations. Do you want to talk about that or not?
I mean, some of it is still live with the Crown Prosecution Service and things like that. I can't really go into any details on some of the things, but I've had some things which are not ideal. Someone trying to break into my house with a hammer and a blowtorch to smash open the front door. People attacking my office and spray painting it and things like that. Which, when it's like, as I say, going after my family or going after my staff, that stuff's really not nice and quite horrible. The stuff that's aimed at me doesn't particularly bother me, and in some ways, it's kind of gratifying when you have large numbers of people shouting about you and furious with you online, people who've never met you. At least they're talking about you and they know who you are and they have an opinion on you.
Do you think any blame for this anger should fall on national politicians? I'm thinking in particular of Lee Anderson, and I see him as emblematic of a kind of politician who presents simplistic arguments that ignore every important nuance, and so you end up with a two-dimensional vision of the world divided into right and wrong.
That is a problem. There are difficulties. Corbynistas were similar. There's an easy solution to everything, and people who don't agree with me, not only are they wrong, they're evil for disagreeing with me. And some political parties are playing very fast and loose with the way that they use social media to kind of demonise people. And some of that isn't great, and there's sort of oversimplification of so many of the challenges facing the country. It's never good. As I say, this sort of questioning of people's motives, that's not great, and it does sort of encourage a not good atmosphere. But again, I'm not entirely certain any of this is new. I just think that it's expressing itself in new ways with the internet.
Let's talk about the recent general election. You must have realised that your chances were slim. How long ago did you know that your time was up?
I thought that I had a very, very, very low chance of being re-elected when the election was called. More than capable of reading opinion polls and also detecting the mood on the doorstep, and knew that it was an uphill battle. I think the moment that I knew that I was most likely not going to get re-elected would be the moment that Liz Truss made the final two of the 2022 leadership contest. Because the moment she made the final two, it was obvious that she was going to win, and it was obvious that she was going to be a disaster, which I think was apparent to anyone who spent more than 5 minutes of talking to her, that was going to be the case. But as I always knew that, with a majority small of mine, when I came in 2019, I always knew that the odds were against me getting re-elected. And I've never been one of those people who thought that just by becoming elected that I was therefore owed to remain a member of Parliament for the rest of my days. It's always on loan.
I saw you during the campaign and you looked like you had the weight of the world on your shoulders. What did it feel like during that campaign when you knew that you didn't have it within your control to win it?
Well, I quite enjoyed the campaign, to be honest with you. I didn't feel, it might have looked like I had the weight of the world upon my shoulders. I didn't actually feel that way. I felt, compared to 2019, which was a very stressful, very intense, very bitter election contest, 2024, I didn't feel that there was an overwhelming level of pressure on me because no one expected me to win. I thought that my chances were very, very slim. I don't do things by halves. I do it and I do it properly. And I didn't want to be in a position where, the polls could have been wrong and I regretted not putting in the work and then lost by a small amount. So I always put in a huge amount of work and effort into everything that I do. But I didn't feel this sort of, oh my gosh, incredible pressure. I wanted to make a good account of myself and I enjoyed the campaign.
In terms of the end result, what does a good campaign look like if it's guaranteed to lose?
Well, I think if you look at the results, frankly, at the start of the campaign, I sort of set myself a target. I thought if I can lose by less than 15,000, that'll have been a pretty good campaign. That'll defy the national swing. And in the end, I lost by less than 8,000. The swing against me was about 8%, which I think the average typical swing in a conservative held marginal seat was something like 20%. So we definitely did an awful lot better than the national picture. If you look at the constituencies next door to High Peak, in Macclesfield, where we were defending a 10,000 majority, and I think we lost by 10,000. In Hazel Grove, where we were defending, 4,500, 5,000 majority, and we finished third in the end in that seat. Derbyshire Dale's one of the safest seats in the country that we lost. Penistone and Stocksbridge, another seat which borders High Peak, defending an 8,000 majority, lost by nearly 10,000. So when you look at all of those, comparing to defending a majority of 500 and losing by less than 8,000, actually we had one of the lowest swings against us of any sitting Conservative seat in the country here. So
what were the highlights of the campaign for you?
Yeah, Yeah, no, there were some really good bits in the campaign. I really enjoyed. Most of the door knocking was really good fun because people were saying, even the ones who weren't voting for me were saying, "Oh, I think you've done a good job as the local MP. I really like you, but I think that I can't vote Conservative. I believe that we need a change of government." It was like, "I really like you personally. You've done a really good job, but I'm not going to vote for you because I can't vote Conservative." But there were also lots of people who were saying, "I'm lifelong Labour, but I'm going to vote for you because I think you're a great local MP." So that was all really nice, and I really enjoyed it.
The one moment when the local campaign broke through into the national newspapers was when your campaign produced an advert that said Labour for Largan and Reform for Robert. Was that national attention just free publicity, or was it a huge headache for you?
No, the only annoying thing was that, largely thanks to a few idiots on Twitter, loads of people submitted complaints to Derbyshire Police. People who clearly have no clue about election law or anything. And so the poor police had to spend half a day wading through these complaints and then explaining to everyone, no, Mr. Largan has done nothing wrong. He's not been under investigation. We've briefly reviewed your complaints and your complaints are completely baseless. That was the only thing which was mildly annoying. But actually, I thought it was quite entertaining. It ended up, the front page of the Glossop Chronicle the following week was, right on that front page, the big poster, Labour for Largan. And then on the inside was an article all about this. Big, nice long quote from me explaining how I was proud that Reform voters and Labour voters were switching to vote for me. If you were to pay for a local paper to have advertising on the wraparound on their front page, that's a very expensive piece of advertising. And I got it for free. So I was actually quite grateful for people like Carol Vorderman and nationally who were sort of doing their best to draw attention to this perfectly legitimate campaigning tactic. People found it, the people who were getting up in arms and were shocked about it, I do wonder what their opinion was on the organisation Blue Labour or Republicans for Biden. It's these things like this, which it's nothing new at all. It's an entirely well-trodden path of campaigning, but for some reason in the internet age, a few people got themselves very worked up.
Well, we're kind of drawing to the end of my list of questions. The only thing that remains to be asked is what next for Rob Largan?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. As you say, I'm taking some time off. I've not had a decent holiday in quite some time. The last holiday I had, I've just got back actually from Dresden. I spent a few days in Germany, which was really lovely. But before that, the last time I went on holiday was the south of France, which was cut short after about 2 days because the council had changed when the planning meeting was going to happen for High Peak Hall. So I had to cut my holiday short and fly back to go to the planning meeting, which then got cancelled at Buxton Town Hall. But this is the first time I've actually had any sort of holiday, and I've never been on a gap year. I'm 37 years old, and I feels like this is the perfect time to go and take a bit of time out, go and do a bit of travelling, get some rest, see the world a bit. So I'm doing that. But other than that, I will no doubt go and get a job. I've joked to a few people that I will follow the Profumo route of starting to clean public toilets as penance. But I don't know, I'm a chartered accountant. I had a career in financial services before I went into Parliament, so I won't starve. Sure, I'll find something interesting and engaging to do, but I'm taking that time out to rest and recuperate and see the world a bit.
I'm sure you'll be following what's happening with the country and the new government. But what challenges do they face? There are expectations of change, but they are severely hampered by lack of funds.
Every government in the Western world, as I've already talked about, is facing an enormous demographic crunch, which is meaning very difficult decisions in terms of taxes and public spending. In many ways, the new government is inheriting quite a strong financial position, particularly in terms of the fastest growing economy in the G7, interest rates going down, inflation the lowest it's been for a very long time. There are some very helpful positions that they're in. But yeah, the enormous demographic challenge that they and other Western countries are facing is shocking. The inability to build things, the problem with the planning system, the problems with energy and infrastructure, which we've already talked about, are enormous. There's also another problem which is facing the whole developed world, which is large-scale migration, which is a huge problem across the entire of Europe, and no one seems to have a particularly good idea about how to deal with it. And so that is a very, very big problem, which the last government was wrestling with, and this government is already having serious challenges with as well. And we will see what policy choices they make in all of those directions.
It's been lovely having a relaxed conversation with you. And I guess it's easier for you to be unguarded now you're no longer an MP. There is this thing nowadays that politicians are not allowed to make a single mistake. I remember last year, Gillian Keegan had to apologise when she was caught on a hot mic complaining that no one ever thanks her for the amount of work that she's done. It caused a big hoo-ha at the time. Are public figures allowed to show their human side from time to time?
There's definitely a expectation that politicians are infallible and perfect, and then and everyone jumps on any mistake they make, and then people wonder why the quality of politicians that comes forward tends to be a lot lower, and people don't want to go into the job. I'm one of these people who kind of kicks back a lot on the idea that, oh, woe is me, being an MP is such a terrible and awful job. This has become quite a fashionable thing for people to say and journalists to say. I reject that. There are absolutely challenges and sacrifices that you have to make, but it is an incredibly challenging and engaging and stimulating role where you're helping shape the future of the country. And if you're not finding that getting you out of bed in the morning and keeping you up at night and being a really engaging and fascinating role, then you're definitely in the wrong job. I don't subscribe to the idea that, oh, being an MP is terrible, it's all awful and miserable, and who on earth would want to do it? But we do sometimes make things unnecessarily difficult for people doing it. Poor Gillian, who was taking a difficult decision around issues of decaying concrete in schools, which arguably had been brushed under the carpet by governments for 20 years, and she sort of went, right, we're going to grip this, and yes, it's going to involve difficult decisions with some schools being closed, but we're going to actually finally, instead of just brushing it under the carpet, we're going to get a grip of it. And we're sort of a huge amount of scrutiny and attack for doing it. And then in an unguarded comment said, it'd be nice if someone could acknowledge that we're finally taking action on this, got done for it. And I do think that sort of the media and journalists in general, I think that their approach and focus, it's not for politicians and governments to say what journalists and media should report on. Good God, no, they shouldn't. I mean, I think the general election campaign that we've just gone through and the focus of the reporting around that campaign is quite indicative of the problem that we have. We are facing existential, massive challenges in this country. How much of the campaign was dedicated to talking about those challenges and what the different parties' policy solutions were?
But politicians are complicit in this dumbing down, aren't they? I used to send out thousands of 4-page letters and receive a good amount of feedback because they were being read. But you'd tell me that the average voter will give a political leaflet 3 seconds, or the time it takes to pick it up from the doormat and walk it to the bin. And then there's the nonsense of party leaders saying they support a football team because someone's told them it polls well amongst working class men.
The age-old rule is you have from the time it takes from someone to pick up a leaflet on their doormat till they get to their bin for you to get across the message that you want. That is sadly a good adage in terms of how you design your literature. And to be fair, I think Starmer genuinely is an Arsenal season ticket holder and quite an avid football fan, from what I can gather, which is probably one of the more normal and likeable aspects of his character. But Cameron definitely wasn't really a Villa fan like he said he was, I'm sure. I very much doubt that he was any particular interest in following Aston Villa's ups and downs of the league. Yeah, there is some of that.
Anyway, Rob, I've kept you talking for 2.5 hours. After we take out all the gaps and make ourselves sound more fluent than we really are, and that's probably more than enough for a podcast. But I will want to invite you back at some point in the future just to talk about, a bit of perspective, maybe a year's time, what you think of it then.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll have a much better idea of where we are in a year's time.
And I know you're not going to answer me because I've asked you before. I can't not ask you, who are you supporting for Conservative leader?
I don't have a vote in the MP stage of the contest, and therefore I don't have to make any decisions on who I'm voting for until we get down to the membership final two.
But you did support Tom Tugendhat last time, didn't you?
I did. The MP stage, I voted for Tom. He was a good friend of mine, and he's a good man. I think there was a number of the candidates this time who were standing who were pretty good.
Do you think it'll come down to the right-wing candidate will get it?
I don't really think so. I mean, I think the problems that the Conservative Party have had over the last 14 years aren't down to when the party was too left-wing or too right-wing. The problems largely come down to a question of delivery, and that is what's going to matter most. Who has the skills and the ability to deliver and to communicate most effectively? I don't think it's an issue of right versus left. I actually think that policy divisions in the party are pretty minimal at the moment. I don't think there are massive, enormous differences in policy amongst the 6 contenders, at least not that I can see. It's more a question of strategy and style and ability. We will see. It's going to be a long contest. I don't think we're deciding until November. When it comes down to the final two and I am a member of the party and I have a vote, I'll make a decision then. I don't think it's a good idea for former members of parliament to try and stick their nose in.
It's been a hugely long and rambling conversation, hasn't it? Oh, it's been lovely.
Yeah, it's been very nice catching up and chatting.
So that's the end of this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this time and maybe learnt something about Rob Largan or the role of an MP. In the next episode, I'll be taking a trip to Chapel Parish Council as a fly on the wall of their monthly meeting. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Nigel Gourlay.
And it's goodbye from me, Robert Largan.